A coroner has ruled missing Sydney fraudster Melissa Caddick has died, although the inquest hasn't been able to determine how. Caddick, who stole millions from investors, was last seen in November 2020. Her severed foot was found washed up on a beach several months later. And as Alison Shaw reports, the coroners dished out some harsh criticism for her husband.
A media scrum outside the New South Wales Coroner's Court. The Sydney fraudster's husband, Anthony Coletti, shoves reporters aside as his brother-in-law honks loudly. Just minutes earlier, and 2.5 years after her disappearance, his wife, Melissa Caddick, was officially ruled dead by a coroner.
I have concluded that Melissa Caddick is deceased.
That's Deputy State Coroner Elizabeth Ryan.
A more problematical issue is whether the evidence is sufficient to enable a positive finding as to how she died and when and where this happened.
But mystery remains.
I've concluded that it is not possible to find that Ms Caddick died as a result of falling from the cliffs near her home with the intention of taking her own life.
There's still a lot of questions to be answered.
Bond University criminologist Terry Goldsworthy says there's no clear picture of how Melissa Caddick's severed foot came to be found on a remote stretch of beach months after her disappearance.
I guess in matters like this, it's the same as where you have a murder but there's no body. You can still make a declaration of death where there's no signs of life. And by that I mean that there's no normal habitual contact with family, there's no access to finances and things like that.
Do you think that there are going to be other forensic remains that would potentially restart a new coronial inquest?
Look, I would have thought if there was any further remains to be found, they would have washed ashore by now. I'd be very surprised if any other forensic material comes to notice, just given the amount of time that's passed. And if the remains are on land somewhere, there's always potential they could be discovered at some later date. We've seen that happen many times.
Forensics expert Dr Xanthi Mallett from the University of Newcastle says it's unfortunate the inquest couldn't shed more light on the circumstances of Melissa Caddick's death, the coroner finding that her body could have entered the water anywhere between Hobart and Brisbane.
It's a little bit, I guess, of a disappointing conclusion, but not surprising, given that we have very little information and very little certainty. I was actually quite surprised at the breadth of area in which the oceanographers determined that Melissa could have entered the water. It was basically impossible for them to determine where she could have entered the water and where other elements of her remains may have washed up.
There's still a lot we don't know. Do you think we will ever know?
Well, I think that's the million-dollar question, isn't it, really? I mean, it's still possible that other remains will become available that may be washed up. In terms of determining what happened to Melissa Caddick, I think we're at least a major pause, if not a full stop, unless more information becomes available. We've got friends and family who still want answers, who still want to know, why she would have done this. So I think part of this is over for those individuals, but they will still have an awful lot of questions that sadly they may never get answers to.
Melissa Caddick's husband was today criticised by the court for failing to give a full account of what he knew.
His evidence is always fairly obvious from the beginning that there was a lack of transparency from the fact, that he didn't report Melissa missing for 30 hours after she disappeared. But I think it became very clear that there's a lot of obfuscation taking place with his evidence. So I would just hope that if he does know something that, his conscience may eventually, kind of come into play, and that he will want to provide those answers to ultimately his friends and family too. He would have known a lot of these people who have been allegedly defrauded.
Focus now turns to the federal court case where the con woman's former clients are fighting to reclaim some of their lost funds she allegedly misappropriated. Niall Coburn is a lawyer who specialises in investment fraud and formerly a senior investigator with the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, which has been investigating Melissa Caddick's alleged Ponzi scheme.
It's a very sad story, not only for her immediate family, like her folks, but the investors trusted supported her. Many of them gave them her life savings and were dependent upon those returns. So it's not really closure for them though, because they still don't know how much they're going to get.
Melissa Caddick is alleged to have stolen some $23 million from investors before she vanished.
Alison Shaw there.